Okay, we are getting ready to start here. I am going to welcome everybody. This is Roger Williams. Welcome to History Author Talks. We've got a great show for you this evening. Before we get going, I have a few things for you. First of all, Happy New Year. Happy holidays. I hope everyone had a great holiday. And are having a good time enduring this cold streak that we're having here. I think it's like 4 degrees outside where I am here in New Jersey right now. Had a very active 10 Crucial Days period here in central New Jersey, where we had some reenactments and some wreath-laying ceremonies. And now we get 2022 all set and up and running. So I'm very pleased that you're all joining us on our first History Author Talks of the year. Very special show, and I will introduce our author in just a moment. As you all know, for those of you who are regular listeners to this show, I'm very proud of my membership in the Sons of the American Revolution. And if you purchase our author's books or any books from History Author Talks, proceeds do go to the Research and Genealogical Library of the Sons of the American Revolution. That being said, anything that we talk about on this show is the opinion of the author or my opinion and not of the Sons of the American Revolution. But tonight, we are going to welcome Christian McBurney, who has a new book coming out in May. So this is a little bit of a teaser, this show. His book, Dark Voyage, which we'll talk about in a minute, is coming out in May, but Christian and I are also members of the Congress of the American Revolutionary War Roundtables. And we had a meeting in November at Mount Vernon, and we had conversations at that meeting about slavery and the American Revolution. And as a result of that conversation, I invited Christian to come on to the show to extend the conversation, because his new book relates to slavery and the American Revolution. We will also talk a little bit about the book that is right now #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, the 1619 Project, because obviously that is related. So with that, I'm going to bring Christian into the program here, and I am going to welcome you to the show, Christian. Christian McBurney is a lawyer in Washington, D.C., and he is also the author of a number of earlier books on the American Revolution. If you go to historyauthortalks.com, you see this blue button right here, and you will see you can click right onto this tab. So welcome, Christian. And if you could tell us a little bit about some of your earlier books first, before we talk about Dark Voyage and our topic of the evening.
Sure, and thank you, Roger, for having me, and welcome everyone on the show. I guess, I started with the Rhode Island campaign book. I used to play a lot with my kids and coach them, but then they didn't want to hang around me anymore. So I thought, what am I going to do? Maybe I'll write a history book. And I was raised in Rhode Island. I have a second home there, have a lot of connections there. So I thought, well, with the American Revolution, what's the most interesting thing that happened? Most significant event was the Rhode Island campaign. It was the first time that the French and the Americans got together to try to take over a major port city in America. So it was a very interesting campaign. And that was my first book. And then that led to, well, what was the second most important event during the Revolution in Rhode Island? And that was kidnapping the enemy. That brought me to that book. The Americans captured Richard Prescott. He's there, the guy on the right there, on Aquidneck Island near Newport. And at night, they took rowboats over from about 6 miles across Narragansett Bay, and without a shot, captured him. What they wanted to do was trade him exchange him for Charles Lee, because Charles Lee had been captured quite foolishly 3 miles from his main troops at Basking Ridge, New Jersey. He was the #2 general to George Washington at the time. So I couldn't just do a book on Richard Prescott, but if I paired it with Charles Lee, then that made it an interesting book. I think it's a very well-written, probably my most well-written book in terms of a narrative and a story. And there's kind of a tragedy at the end, but then gets to be a good ending. And then that led to George Washington's, abductions in the American Revolution, because, there's not only these 2 abductions, there were all sorts of abductions and attempts. And, George Washington was a target of several attempts, including one across the ice in New York City when he was in Morristown. He was also 3 miles from his troops. So 300 cavalrymen tried to capture Washington. And other events, the Americans tried to capture Benedict Arnold in New York City when he was with the British after he turned traitor. All sorts of interesting ones. And then that led me to go back to Charles Lee, George Washington's nemesis, the outrageous treason and unfair court-martial of Major General Charles Lee. Lee, when he was a prisoner, actually wrote a plan. Hey, British, this is how you defeat the Americans. I think the Americans are going to lose, so let's save bloodshed and get it over with quickly as possible. I call that treason. On the other hand, when he was released and no one knew about this plan on the American side, he commanded troops at the Battle of Monmouth, and I think he did very well by retreating, because 2/3 of his troops had retreated without orders under other generals. But he was convicted of unwarranted retreat and a shameful retreat in certain circumstances. And I think that was unfair. So they're all kind of connected. Now we get to my newest book, Dark Voyage. And actually that started when I was at the Williamsburg conference, the Bruce Venter's Williamsburg conference. And I think it was 2017. Dennis Conrad, a friend of mine, spoke. And he mentioned this Marlborough, which American privateer from Rhode Island. As you know, I have that Rhode Island connection. And it went to Africa and attacked British slave trade interests, plundered a fort, captured British slave ships. So it was, I found that fascinating. I said, wow, that's going to be my next book. So that's the one that's coming out in May.
So thanks for that overview of your works. I would not be able to pinpoint which is the best narrative, because I found them all fascinating. I learned so much from each of your books, and as I mentioned at the beginning, this is kind of a preview of Dark Voyage because I'm reading it right now, and once again, learning so much. In this day and age, with there being so much in the headlines these days about civic education and civil rights, the book could not be more timely. And obviously with the 1619 Project having come out, it certainly made a bit of a stir in November of 2019, when the 1619 Project was first released. And I think this is a part of our history, which 2 white guys like you and me are certainly have to reach back and understand all of our American history. But I found what you have written particularly interesting. So to sort of set the stage for us, if you would, Christian. But before I start, everybody, I want you to use the chat feature in Zoom. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little chat sign. If you have questions for Christian, please use the chat feature. Those questions will come to me, and we'll fit those into the program. So I invite all of you to join us in this conversation. So getting back to my first question, Christian, if you can sort of set the stage for us. Why you made the point, and this was as a result of an email that came to me, and you talk about this in Dark Voyage, that the American Revolution was actually a great anti-slavery movement in world history. Explain.
Sure, and I think it's important to set the stage as an historian. You can't just look back from our present day circumstances and compare what was going on then. What you have to do is what happened prior, what was the conditions of the state of society prior to the event you're looking at, and what was it afterwards, and was there progress? And in the case of anti-slavery movement, there was almost nothing going on before the American Revolution. And the American Revolution definitely spurred a lot of anti-slavery activity, and it kept going and going and going. So I do think it's one of the most significant events in world history in terms of the abolitionist movement, underrated, and I think it's something to be proud of, actually. But of course, it wasn't a complete success. Unlike the American Revolution itself, that was a great progress in terms of human events. We were ruled by a king. The aristocracy dominated society. America was colonial possession and exploited. And now we created this new society where there's lots of freedom and liberty. That was more successful in the long run, in the short run, excuse me, than the abolitionist movement. But still, there was significant progress in the abolitionist movement. And you know, a lot of times with these world movements, you can't just, you don't snap a finger and everything goes from bad to good. It takes time. It's like a wave. Sometimes it goes forward, comes back a little bit, goes forward. So the change doesn't happen all at once, but there was significant change in the American Revolution. Now, what was going on prior to the American Revolution in terms of slavery? Really, the dominant force were European powers. They had colonial possessions in the Caribbean, primarily, that owned extremely valuable plantations, sugar plantations. Sugar was the the tech industry of those days. It would you could just make tons of money. England, France, Spain, Portugal, they all had sugar plantations and used African slaves to do the work. The primary, in the 25 years before the American Revolution, Britain dominated the slave trade. The conditions were so bad in the British Caribbean islands like Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados, that they had to replace 6% per year of their workforce just to maintain their workforce because so many died. So they had this constant flow of slaves from Africa. And indeed, for all the European countries, 95% of them came from of the African captives were taken to European power colonial possessions. But again, Britain definitely dominated it in the last third quarter of the 18th century. Created great wealth. I mean, they just, it made the tobacco and industry in Virginia and rice in South Carolina, very small in comparison.
So, we talk about the 13 colonies that rebelled. The British actually had 26 colonies in this hemisphere. What made the 13 that rebelled different than the 13 that didn't?
Slavery. The American Revolution actually created some great sympathy in places like Jamaica and Barbados and Antigua, but they dared not break away from Britain for two reasons. One, they wanted the might of the British military and navy to keep their slave populations in control. Some of these, the ratio of blacks to whites was 70% Black in many instances or more. And also they needed Britain to replenish their slave stock every year. Britain sent out 150 to 190 ships to Africa to bring slaves from Africa to the Caribbean. It's just hard to believe that the slave trade ever existed. It's just mind-boggling now. But back then, it was treated as a part of life.
And moving to the 13 colonies specifically, what was the demographic of slavery in what is now the United States and the 13 colonies?
Sure. Every colony had enslaved people in it. A lot of people don't know that the North had slaves. New England was about 3% of the population, so it was not dominant, but if you were living in towns, you would see enslaved people walking around. You would interact with them. Rhode Island was even more, about 6%. Rhode Island was actually the greatest slave trading colony of the 13 colonies. And that's another reason why I got involved in this topic, because of the Rhode Island connection. And more than 50% of the slave voyages from the 13 colonies emanated from Rhode Island during the colonial period. Now, it's still a very small number. The number of North American voyages was overall was, out of 12 million, more than 12 million, was about 3.2%, so pretty small. And most of the Africans that were brought to North American colonies actually came on British ships. Of course, most of the enslaved people were in the South. Virginia had a very developed tobacco culture. At the time of the Revolution, some of the lands were being over-farmed, so they were moving into wheat. In South Carolina, it was extremely wealthy. It was almost like a Caribbean country with rice and indigo. And it's the percentage of the enslaved population in South Carolina was 60%, 50% in colonial times. And about the Revolution, it was a little over 40%. So huge, huge population. And Georgia was just opening up its slave institution.
So, the question from the audience wants to know, Henry wants to know what other countries, you mentioned that the British were the overwhelming majority of the bringing slaves over. What other countries?
Portugal overall was number one, if that's something to be proud of. And the reason was really Brazil. The Portuguese Brazilians brought over, they started earlier in the 1500s and they ended 60 years after Britain outlawed the slave trade in 1807. But again, during this 18th century, Britain really dominated the slave trade. Number two is France. They had a lot of colonial possessions, Guadeloupe, Haiti, St. Lucia, Martinique. They were even more profitable than the British plantations. Spain also as well, and even a little bit of Denmark and Sweden.
So, was there much abolitionist activity in Britain prior to the American Revolution?
There really wasn't. I think that, the first version of the 1619 Project tried to make it out as there was, but there really wasn't. Anti-slavery activity in England didn't really start until Thomas Clarkson's campaign in 1787. Before then, there's a little bit here and there. The most important event was the Mansfield decision, which was interpreted as saying that, if a Black person or an enslaved person arrived in England, the air is free and they are therefore freed as well. There was some concern that maybe that would, become the law in the British Caribbean and America, but there was no chance of that. It was just the Britain was getting huge amounts of money from its colonies, especially the British Caribbean. There was just no chance that would ever be applied there. And of course, slavery in British Caribbean didn't end until 1833.
So now moving into the Revolution.
I guess I will say in America, to be fair, there was some anti-slavery movement among the Quakers.
Right.
Benjamin Lay, John Woolman, Anthony Benezet, these were really impressive people who believed in the humanitarian cause against slavery, were very eloquent in opposing slavery and the slave trade. But the problem was, and they really helped set the stage for the revolution. So sometimes you would have Congregationalist ministers copying large segments of Anthony Benezet's pamphlets. But they were considered kind of an outlier religious community, the Quakers. They were not mainstream. And until you got the Congregationalists involved, the Baptists, the Methodists, you weren't going to reach most of the American people.
So we know we have all those troublemakers up there in Massachusetts who were the ones who really got the Crown their heckles up and started this ruckus with the American Revolution up in Lexington and Concord. And patriots emphasized that their freedom and rights were being infringed by Britain. Often they would accuse Britain of trying to enslave them. Did they realize that they were being hypocritical since enslaved people were actually held in the 13 colonies?
Yes, they did recognize that it was hypocritical. And that's one reason I think that instigated the anti-slavery movement during the Revolutionary War, because they recognized, they weren't totally stupid, as W.E. Du Bois kind of intimated. And so I think that desire for freedom and liberty and not being controlled by another country, but for personal freedom as well, it definitely instilled a lot of the momentum for anti-slavery activity.
So moving into the middle colonies here a little bit.
Well, we'll start with the northern colonies.
Well, I just have a question. Though, about the Quakers. You were talking about the Quakers before. What about William Penn? What was his position on slavery?
I believe he supported slavery. Now, of course, he was back in the 17th century, and the anti-slavery movement, so to speak, didn't really start until the 18th century. Really till the American Revolution. When we talk about reform these days, we have all sorts of reform movements. Back then, they were virtually unknown. There was no anti-slavery movement. And so it really, I think, started from the American Revolution. He was, in that time, there was a few comments here and there, ironically, why not? Judge Sewell of witch trial fame came out against slavery, so that was pretty impressive. But there were a few calls in the wilderness, but not very much.
Sure. So that was answering a question for one of our audiences. Let's get back to Lexington and Concord. Tell us about the anti-slavery activity that commenced in the buildup of Lexington and Concord.
Yeah, again, as you pointed out, Massachusetts was important for the birthplace of the Revolution, and it was also really the start of a lot of anti-slavery activity, starting with James Otis. Of course, he, with the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and his rights of pamphlet, he was talking about no taxation without representation. But for some reason, he decided to say, oh, by the way, Black people should have equal rights with white people. There really shouldn't be any difference. And the slave trade is one of the worst violations of human nature on the planet. So, kudos to James Otis. And as the Revolutionary War activity commenced, you had a lot of activity with Congregationalist ministers coming out against the slave trade, coming out against slavery. And then you had John Allen, who was a Baptist, wrote a very strong, he wrote a pamphlet primarily defending the Gaspee affair in Rhode Island, the burning of the HMS revenue schooner Gaspee. But then he just kind of, for no particular relation to that topic, starts talking about the evils of the slave trade and slavery. So very interesting. Rhode Island, as I said, was the main center, especially Newport, of the slave trade in colonial times in North America. It was small compared to Britain, but in North America, it was definitely dominant. But you had two leaders, three really, that were anti-slavery. One was Samuel Hopkins. He was the Congregationalist minister in Newport. He was probably the most eloquent anti-slavery speaker in all the colonies. There was Moses Brown. He was a member of the Brown family. And John Brown was the one who funded the privateer that I talk about in my most recent book. And his brother Moses and his other brothers, at one point, 1763, they funded a slave trade voyage to Africa, which turned out disastrously. Isaac Hopkins, who had become commander-in-chief of the Navy, captained that ship, and 109 died, most of disease and some of suicide. But Moses repented his participation in the slave trade. He became a Quaker, and he was very eloquent and persuasive against slavery. In 1774, Rhode Island actually passed an act to ban the importation of slaves. Probably the first jurisdiction in the world to do that after doing a fair bit of importations. I haven't come across any legislature, let's call it, that has done that. So that's pretty significant.
That was 1774.
Yeah, Massachusetts tried to do that, but they had a royal governor. The royal governor said, no, I have instructions from London. You can't do anything to hurt the slave trade. It's too important. And the Liverpool merchants and Bristol and London merchants that were engaged in slave trade were very influential. So no, you can't ban the slave trade. But Rhode Island was so small, it got away with it.
Interesting. So now let's move a little bit south into the middle colonies. Was there any slavery, anti-slavery activity in the middle colonies?
Yes, there was. And in the North, the biggest concentrations of slaves were in New York State, including New York City and New Jersey, and Philadelphia as well. All of the states tried to limit the imports of African captives, but none succeeded because of royal governors saying, no, you can't do that, or London quashing the efforts. So this is an example of, America wants to control its own destiny in this regard. It's prevented by its masters in London. In Philadelphia, you had very eloquent pamphlet published by Benjamin Rush, Dr. Benjamin Rush, very much a powerful statement against the slave trade and slavery. And he even went so far as to say that Black children and white children were the same. Blacks and whites should be treated equally in the eyes of the law and the Lord. That went a little too far. I mean, even though that you did see this increase in anti-slavery activity, there still was plenty of racism in the North. And apparently, according to his biographer, Rush lost some business as a result of that. But still, very impressive piece.
So we have a question here from Angela in the audience. I'm going to read her question. There's a little bit of a juxtaposition, but I'll have you answer as you are the historian. Early on, there were indentured servants, including Blacks. When were Blacks made slaves by law?
Well, that's a complicated topic, and I really can't get into it, in part because I'm not an expert.
Yeah.
But a lot of it happened in Virginia. Indentured servitude was the first large labor force that was used to create the plantations. But, white Americans tended to run away, and it was hard to tell who was a former indentured servant and who wasn't. Easier to tell if they were a Black person from Africa who couldn't speak the language. But, there are some books on the topic, and I think basically the mid 1600s was when it really started to, indentured servitude started going out, and slavery based on race, inherited slavery, passed on by the children of the mother. That's when it really started to be instituted.
Angela, I will say to you and to everybody, a little bit of a commercial here. On February 15th, on History Author Talks, we're welcoming Larry Kidder, who has just published a new book called The Revolutionary World of a Free Black Man, about Jacob Francis, who was an indentured servant. and a soldier in the Continental Army. So, Angela, for more information, I invite you to tune in on February 15th when Larry Kidder joins us to talk about his book. So now, all right, so we've been up with those troublemakers up in Massachusetts and the middle colonies now. Tell us about anti-slavery activity in the southern colonies. This is a bit more challenging.
It is, but it's surprising that there's so much. It's quite shocking. Of course, it's led by Thomas Jefferson. I think in his early years, he was very anti-slavery. His pamphlet, The Summaries of the Rights Examined, 1774, was very strongly anti-slavery. Accused Britain of not basically saying, "Look, we got to get rid of slavery. It's got to be eliminated. The first thing we need to do is to stop the slave trade. But you, the king, are stopping us from prohibiting slave imports." So, yeah, pretty shocking. There were anti-slavery speeches made at the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg by Richard Henry Lee, by Arthur Lee, George Mason. Now, some of this was not necessarily humanitarian. It was, well, we don't want any more Black people, and we want white people to develop the economy. We want to encourage more white immigration. But George Mason was very eloquent on humanitarian grounds that the slave trade was wrong, it should be stopped. And he, even though he believed in slavery, interestingly, he was very eloquent against the slave trade. Even George Washington, when he went to the First Continental Congress, he carried the Fairfax Resolves, which said we're not going to participate in the slave trade with Britain anymore. So, and then South Carolina was really, the two problem children, so to speak, are South Carolina and Georgia. South Carolina, very wealthy with the rice and indigo, had a high percentage of slaves, and Georgia was just developing and growing. They needed more African captives to expand. And but even there, they did have prohibitions on imports of enslaved people.
So, all right, so now let's move to the government. Tell us about the First Continental Congress and the Articles of Association.
Sure. The Articles of Association, First Continental Congress met. By the way, I think I saw one chat from my friend Bob Wong, and he asked about collaboration in the slavery and the slave trade in Africa among Africans. And I do address that quite a bit in my upcoming book, Dark Voyage. So you learn a lot in that book about how the slave trade worked, how there was collaboration, and how the Americans kind of took advantage of that. But that's a different topic. The First Continental Congress was, the first Congress where all the representatives of the colonies came to Philadelphia, and they wanted to, have a reaction, a response to Britain for punishing Boston for the Boston Massacre. I'm sorry, not the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party. So Richard Henry Lee was very much behind, let's have a ban on trade with England. The second ban that they had was a ban on American participation in the slave trade. This was shocking. This wasn't just a ban on participating with England against the slave trade. It was a ban on participating against anyone in the slave trade. So that was pretty shocking. And I think what happened there was that South Carolina and Georgia dropped the ball, which they wouldn't do again. But this was actually followed. There was a threat of being boycotted by merchants. And so merchants, and even in Rhode Island, generally followed this ban on participating in the slave trade. And during the Revolution, there was actually a ban on any imports at all from Africa. So even from that perspective, it was helpful. Even in South Carolina, when they passed the ban, there was a slave ship just about to arrive from Africa. It probably left Britain, 8 months ago. Had no idea about this congressional resolution, but Charleston said, no, we're not, we're going to follow the Continental Congress, and we're not going to allow that ship to land.
All right, so now it's time to declare independence. Tell us what the Declaration said and didn't say about slavery.
Well, the most important part of the Declaration of Independence is the one we all know best, and is most important worldwide, one of the most important statements in world history in my book. All men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, enslaved people did not have that. Women didn't have it. Not even all white men had it, but it set the stage for that possibility. And, over the years, there was progress made, and everyone could point to those words. Interestingly, the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 did not free slaves. John Adams said, "Oh, we don't want to divert our energies to beat the British by causing a division within the colonies," so he didn't want to do that. But the preamble had a similar language to Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. And during the war in 1780, two sets of enslaved people filed petitions with the court and said, "Look, this says we're free. I'm entitled to inalienable rights and pursuit of happiness." And they won. So that's how slavery ended in Massachusetts. Now, slavery was mentioned in a few other places in the Declaration. Jefferson tried to add a paragraph that said, "Hey, King, you're responsible for slavery in America. You encouraged the slave trade. You brought slaves over here, enslaved people, and we didn't like that." Now that's pretty hypocritical, but so it was ultimately excised. But still, it's kind of shocking that it was even written. That's the kind of, you hear about rage militaire in 1775, 76, which the soldiers were very enthusiastic about freedom and liberty. And I think he had kind of a similar rage abolitionism in these early years of the American Revolution. Now, there was another reference to slavery in the Declaration of Independence, and I'll talk about that a little later.
So, and I know you can't go into details about each state. I mean, we'd be on all night, but what happened with the institution of slavery in the North after the war?
Well, in the North, it essentially ended. It took some time, but there's a direct path between the American Revolution and the end of slavery in the North. So that's impressive. That was real progress in the anti-slavery movement worldwide. Had not been done before in the world. So in my view, I think that's something, to be proud of. Some of these states, it was gradual emancipation, like Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. So, the children would be eventually free. In reality, it happened much quicker than that. There were negotiations between slaves and slave owners for freedom, working several years and then being freed. Some ran away, some joined the army and became free. I studied a lot of the Rhode Island Regiment, where more than 100 African Americans joined the 1st Rhode Island and became free upon enlisting, and fought very well at the Battle of Rhode Island, by the way. So in other states, it was done by judicial fiat. In Massachusetts, for example. Why don't you tell what happened in Vermont, Roger?
Well, thanks for asking. This was not a setup. I am a member of the founding families of Vermont, and
I would have thought Rhode Island based on your name. But okay.
Well, my mother was born in Providence, but I actually, the family came from Vermont. In 1777, Vermont declared itself a republic. This was before it was not one of the 13 colonies. It was actually land that was disputed between New Hampshire and New York. It was called the Hampshire Land Grants. But in Windsor County, Vermont, which is where my ancestors came from, the Constitution of the state of Vermont was the first in, I believe, world history that banned slavery.
Hmm.
No,
Immediately, not gradually.
yeah, not gradually, just right there. And there is some family history. We don't have anything definitive, but Phineas Williams, who I am a direct descendant, was a member of that body. Now, I don't know if he was a part of that, but we do know that he was a member of the body of the that was at the Windsor County Courthouse when that was declared. So thanks for asking. It's sound risk of name dropping, but all right. So now it's going to get complicated.
Well, of course, you have to, I have to mention about the South.
Yeah.
Slavery not ended in the South.
I was going to say, now it's going to get complicated, right?
Yeah. Even in Virginia, where you had so much, people said, oh, slavery is going to end eventually. Jefferson thought that. Washington did free his enslaved people at his death. But he was the only founder to do so, major founder. But slavery continued. It was just too entrenched, too important. South Carolina, they weren't going anywhere with slavery, and neither was Georgia. So it was
the problem children.
Complete success. But on the other hand, after the war ended, they had an opposition to slavery in the North. And that was an important start.
So I want to talk about the 1619 project, but let's go to some of our questions from some of our audience members here. So you addressed Bob's question about the acquisition of slaves in Africa. Linda and Bob Barth have asked the question about the privateer in Dark Voyage. Again, I know this is a teaser, and I'll let everyone know that in May, when the book comes out, we're going to have Christian back to talk about the fascinating story, because it's an amazing story. But Bob, or Christian, if you could tell us just a little bit about the privateer, the Marlborough, in the book.
Well, it was a strong privateer in terms of guns. A lot of them were 6 guns or 10 guns. This was 20 guns. It was a brig, 3-masted, manned mostly by Rhode Island and Massachusetts men, some from Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard. And I can't tell that any of them were ever engaged in the slave trade. I don't believe they were. But suddenly, John Brown was the key man behind the decision. As I said, he was engaged in the slave trade, 2 voyages in colonial times. Wasn't his main business, of course, only 2, but he knew about it. And he also talked to Newport slave traders. So he knew Africa, and he knew that the Royal Navy was all over the British Caribbean now. And I argue in my book that the American privateers captured so many British slave ships coming from Africa to the Caribbean, hours before they were going to drop off their African captives and sell them for huge profits. They would be captured by American privateers. And because the American privateers captured so many, London and Liverpool investors invested a lot less in slave voyages. And I estimate that saved about 60,000 African captives from coming from Africa to the British Caribbean. So, I think that's a positive. On the other hand, the privateers, what were they interested in? Sharing of profits.
Right.
Was the cargo here? It was human cargo. So there's a story too.
So that leads into James's question. James lives near Hilton Head, South Carolina, and the first slaves that were brought to Hilton Head by William Hilton came from Barbados. In your research, did you come up with approximate how many slaves came from the Caribbean into the South, to America versus as opposed to from Africa?
That's a good question. There's actually a book called on the intercolonial slave trade. A lot of the focus has been on the slave trade directly from Africa to South Carolina, Virginia, or places in the north. But there was also some slave trade between the Caribbean, especially in South Carolina. There was a lot of the planters there actually came from the Caribbean. So there was definitely some of that.
So Henry asked the question, did piracy impact the slave trade? Piracy and privateering is there's a gray area there. So, but he asked specifically about piracy. Is it?
Well, privateering is legalized taking shit.
Exactly.
Piracy is you don't have, you got a commission from Congress, even though Britain didn't recognize Congress. But piracy, there's no commission, no government legitimacy. And privateers, you got to follow certain laws and rules. You can't attack. You can attack enemy shipping, but you can't just attack anybody.
Right.
Which they had no laws and no rules, they would attack anybody. So I haven't studied piracy and slavery too much. I know they did capture some slave ships now and again, especially in the 17th century, but I haven't followed up to. Maybe that'll be interesting next book. Who knows?
So Johnny asked a very specific question about the Morris family in New Jersey. Brought some of the slaves to New Jersey. Do you know anything about the Morris? Did you, in your research, did you come up with anything about the Morris family?
No.
No. Okay.
As there's Robert Morris and Gouverneur Morris. Robert Morris of the Continental Congress was a big investor in American privateers, and some of his privateers scored it big and captured British slave ships with 300, 400 on board. Right.
So one last question before we get to our final topic of discussion here. Warren asks, are there any remaining vestiges of the colonial slave trade that persist in countries today?
I'm not an expert. There's nothing like what happened then. I mean, Britain was sending over 40 to 45,000 a year from Africa to the British Caribbean. France, maybe 20,000. Portugal, 35,000. Just every year, time again, it was just massive numbers. So nothing like that again. There is some, you can call it slavery of people from third world countries and young women and children forced to, sold by their parents to, and then, sent off to perform labor, free labor, and unfree situations. There is some of that definitely.
So I will just answer. I will answer that question with one comment that my brother-in-law Daniel Goldhagen has written a book called Worse Than War: Genocide, Eliminationism, and Ongoing Assault on Humanity, which talks about modern slavery. It's really quite disturbing. So to the person who asked that question about slavery in the modern world, you can get some information there. All right, so we have a few other questions, but we only have a few minutes left, and I really wanted to get to the conversation that you and I had that started when we were at Mount Vernon about the 1619 Project. I've been reading the 1619 Project. I'm almost finished it. I've learned a lot. I mean, as I said, look, there's a lot of history we can learn from a lot of different history books. It is journalism as opposed to history. And when I say that, what I mean by that is that there is a lot of opinion. And at the risk of stepping on toes, some of it, frankly, is not necessarily backed up by academic research. But if you could talk a little bit about the original New York Times piece with Nicole Hannah-Jones as the primary author. She had some controversial statements about the motives of the Declaration of Independence. Explain what your reading of that was.
Sure. And, overall, I think the 1619 project is a positive. Give a different perspective on history and more fuller, complete picture. But there's just there's too much unwarranted exaggeration and claims that just are not supported by historical fact. And as an historian, that upsets me. The first New York Magazine article, the most controversial statement in there was that one of the primary reasons for the Declaration of Independence was the desire of patriots to preserve slavery. And it's just totally unwarranted. And actually, as I've just demonstrated to all of you today, the opposite is true, that the Southern slavery had the most to fear from the North, and that the North, the progress, including even Virginia, talking anti-slavery talk was really revolutionary in world history and a real advance in world history. And Britain wasn't going to end the slave trade or slavery in America anytime soon. So it was actually quite the opposite was true. And actually, there was an advisor that Nicole Hannah-Jones and her staff turned to who said basically the same thing, but they didn't listen to her. And in the most recent book, they definitely backed off that claim.
Exactly. And it's really, when one reads the book, it really deals a lot, almost entirely, other than the first initial articles, really more about racism and Jim Crow through our history, as opposed to our founding ideals. And as I think you have outlined, our founding ideals obviously sets the framework that perhaps our founders didn't necessarily mean that I mean, it states all men are created equal. Well, we can argue this forever, that, well, it didn't mean women or blacks, but in the precepts of the Age of Enlightenment, I think we all agree that in modern society, all men and women are created equal. I think that's really where I think a lot of that comes from. I think that so we have just.
Well, I'll talk about Nicole Henry-Jones's her chapter in the most recent book, in which she makes much more measured claims, but still she seems very. And by the way, there are some excellent chapters. I'd encourage people to read the one on sugar, for example, and British on the Caribbean islands. It was excellent. But she seems to be have a little more political vein in her writing, and she seems very intent on tying the slavery and the Declaration of Independence. So the main argument here is Dunmore's proclamation. So Governor Dunmore, the Earl of Murray, was fighting against the Patriots. He didn't have much support, so he said, "Hey, enslaved people of Virginia, if you come to my side," only on the Patriots, by the way. He didn't extend this to loyalists, to enslaved people. And you can take up arms and join my army. And about 1,000 to 2,000 did. And it upset Virginia slaveholders a lot. No question about that. But he was defeated, and he was forced out in December 1775, January 1776. So when it came to the Declaration of Independence in July 1776, it was an event. And by 1619 project mentioning this, it does provide a more complete picture of what happened. That clearly some slaveholders were offended by what happened, and it did help propel them to support the Declaration of Independence. But what percentage? Pretty small. On a scale of 1 to 100, maybe I give it a 6, something like that. But Nicole Hannah-Jones tries to turn it into, 52 or something like that. She also makes the argument, well, the Continental Congress was dominated by Virginians. She has to tie the Dunmore's Proclamation of Virginia to dominating Continental Congress, and that just doesn't hold water either. It's a little disappointing. She does seem to want to tie slavery and the Declaration of Independence very much, but doesn't make the most compelling case. But there is some, there's some a little bit of truth in that, because Dunmore's Proclamation was pretty much ignored 20 years ago. Doug Edgerton and some other historians began talking about it, Gary Nash. So it's a more complete picture discussing it. And actually, it does appear in the Declaration of Independence. You do have to that. Jefferson said, hey, King, you were encouraging, your generals were encouraging slave insurrections. Clear reference to Dunmore's Proclamation. So
right.
Deny that. So it was definitely a factor, but was how important a factor? I don't think it was that important factor. In July 1776, you had Lexington and Concord, you had Bunker Hill, you had private Royal Navy ships capturing and imprisoning Americans. A lot was going on there, more than this.
So last question, as we move toward our 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, what is your recommendation to historic sites and historical interpreters and about how we should be teaching our history to this new generation?
Well, it sounds like a next program, Roger.
It's every program. I love asking this question.
Yeah. Well, I think you can tell where I'm coming from. That I think actually, if you're just, of course, the revolution is much more than just slavery, of course, but that does seem to be an important topic today. So it's even there. I think that's actually a positive story. When you look before what was happening, nothing was happening with anti-slavery activity, nothing of consequence. And afterwards, wow, it just started to build and build and build until you got to the Civil War. On the other hand, it was a hope unfulfilled. Slavery did not end after the revolution. We had to fight a civil war, tragic civil war. A lot of Black people suffered for generations. So that was unfortunate too. But again, something as big as an anti-slavery movement, abolitionist movement worldwide, the revolution was definitely progress.
Good. Well, Christian, I thank you. I mean, I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I did. I really, I've learned so much just from this conversation, but also in reading your book, and I look forward to having you come back in May. For everybody else, I have next week, I've got Cole Jones from Purdue talking about his book, Captives of Literary, Prisoners of War on the Politics of Vengeance During the American Revolution. On January 25th, my friend David Stewart, who's a renowned historian, has written
and lawyer like me.
And lawyer, right, has written a trilogy. The first book called The New Land, about a Hessian officer a Hessian family who's come over and settled Maine in the French and Indian War. That's his first book. So he's going to come talk on Tuesday, the 25th. Then we have Don Hagest, who is the managing editor at Journal of American Revolution, who's written a book about the British Grenadier and Light Infantry battalions in the American Revolution. You can hear my bell ringing in the back. Then we've got Gene O'Connor, who's written a novel called The Remarkable Cause, a novel of James Lovell and the Crucible of the American Revolution. It's a terrific read, and you learn a lot with that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, my friend Larry Kidder, who's written The Revolutionary War World of a Free Black Man, Jacob Francis, on February 15th. Larry is my partner in 10 Crucial Days, which you see right over my shoulder there. 10crucialdays.org is a nonprofit organization that supports the sites of the 10 Crucial Days, Washington's Crossing and the Battle of Princeton. And so we thank you for your support of 10crucialdays.org. And so until then, I want to thank Christian again, and I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening on History Author Talks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, Roger.
You bet. Thanks, Jeff.